Hello, and welcome to the National Archives Foundation virtual program series. I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm Patrick Madden. I'm the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation. We're happy to have you here today. Thanks for joining us from home. We've got a fantastic program for you. Through this program, we open the doors of the National Archives Foundation through the spirited discussions, and you have a chance to explore these fantastic records that are held for us, the American people. By now, you've been receiving our American Experience emails on Tuesdays, or for our younger viewers, History Snacks on Fridays, where we customize the material that we send out for a little fun for families and kids. Today, we've got two terrific authors who are going to talk about the suffrage movement. Before we begin and get to them, I want to make sure you're able to ask your questions. So in the YouTube video chat, you'll see on the right side, you'll be able to put in your questions there. That's where we're taking our questions. And if you've been with us over the last couple of weeks for these programs, you know I'm going to ask you for your hometown right now. Let's practice. Let's get that chat going. So send me your hometown, city and state. I'll give you a shout out a little bit later. I see some folks are putting their locations in now. We love to see that folks are watching from all over the country. So now to our speakers. We've got Rebecca Boggs Roberts, the author of Suffragists in Washington, D.C., the 1913 Parade and the Fight for the Vote, the Historic Congressional Cemetery, not the same book. She has been many things, including a journalist, producer, tour guide, forensic anthropologist, event planner, political consultant, jazz singer. We might have to get into that in the Q&A. And she's currently the curator of programming at Planet Word Museum of Language Arts. She is joined by Lucinda Robb, who's a project director of Our Mothers Before Us, Women in Democracy at the Center for Legislative Archives. We will definitely be talking about that. Lucinda's a fantastic person and one of my bosses and on the board of the National Archives Foundation. That project that she worked on at the Legislative Archives rediscovered thousands of overlooked original documents. It produced a traveling exhibit, educational materials. She was a part of celebrating the 75th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. So she's got a few thoughts and ideas on this topic, no doubt. She serves on the board of Running Start, a bipartisan group that trains young women to run for office. So Lucinda and Rebecca, welcome. How are you guys doing?
Hi, thanks, Patrick.
Good.
So happy to be here.
Great. We're delighted to have you guys and hear about this book that's been under wraps. And today, I believe this is the first time you guys are talking about it. So we're excited to have the sneak preview. Before we jump into everything, you know, how are you all doing? How's your family doing during this tough time?
Well, I think my children have melded with their screens and we've eaten an enormous amount of ice cream. I wish I could say we've done all of these wonderful things. My oldest daughter is trying to teach herself Korean, but for the most part, my kids are so bored, they're actually looking forward to online school starting again.
Wow.
Yeah, my kids are a little older than Lucinda's. Mine are all teenagers and they're also all boys. So really, as long as we just keep the groceries coming, all is pretty peaceful around here.
I can appreciate that with 3 teenagers myself. Before we get into the book, this is a big week, the 100th anniversary. What are you all doing to celebrate the centennial?
You know, I actually am spending tomorrow, the actual centennial, driving one of those teenagers to college. But I've had the chance over the last week to give a ton of talks, sit on some panels, and really take advantage of this kind of white hot spotlight on this moment in history from so many different angles, you know, talking about the new book, talking about the political tactics, talking about what's been left out of the history. And it's been so great to just see not just the curiosity on the part of the public, but the amazing scholarship that's coming out while this attention is on it.
Obviously, there were a lot of things that were planned that now have had to move online, and hopefully I'll be able to do some of those. But I've also been thinking a lot, particularly as we run up to the anniversary, about the debt that I have as a white woman and a white woman from a southern state to Frederick Douglass, who was one of the original and most important allies for the suffrage movement. So because I want to get out of the house, I think tomorrow I'm going to try to go over to Anacostia to his home. It's part of the National Park Service and it's actually closed. But I want to stay outside and see if I can get some pictures and really just have a chance to pay my respects to someone who made such a difference so early on.
That's terrific. Well, I know we're going to dig into the very long history of the suffrage movement, but let's talk about you two. When was the first time you voted? Do you remember the first time you voted? What that experience was like? I assume your families encouraged you to do that. So tell me a little bit about that feeling, because this is what the whole movement was about.
Yeah, I remember it incredibly well. So I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland, and in Maryland at the time, even if you weren't 18 by the primary, if you were going to be 18 by the general, you could vote in the primary. And they actually came and registered us in public high school. They came and did a voter drive at my public high school. And so this, to date me, would have been the 1988 election. And I was going to be in college by the general. So I really wanted to show up at the polls for the primary. And my dad and I went together and we walked down to the local elementary school, and I had totally done my homework on it was presidential year. I had my candidate, I had all my justifications for it, and I had forgotten all about all the other races on the ballot. And so I got in the voting booth and I saw all these other down ballot races, and I thought, every other voter must be enormously well educated about all of the county council races and all of the tax propositions. And I felt like I had right out of the gate failed my first time as a voter because I had only been thinking about president. So I came out of the booth and I said to my dad, I feel terrible. Like I didn't know what else to do for all these other races. And he said, so what'd you do? I said, I just voted for all the women.
I wish I had a story that good. The truth is, it's all sort of a blur. My parents started taking me to the polls as early as I can remember. Especially there was a time when my dad was running for office. So I specifically remember going with him as sort of a, election day event when I was 12 years old. And ever since then, I've been going very regularly. In my family, obviously, it's considered your sacred duty. There is no excuse barring death for not showing up to vote.
And
in fact, my mother will call me up. And in Virginia, we have off-year elections. So you get to vote every single year. And my mother will call me up, anytime there's an election or a primary election, she'll be like, have you voted? And usually it's 12 o'clock. I'm like, yes, Mom, I voted. Or, I have a plan to go vote later. So I have tried to do the same with my children. And as they got old enough to, be moderately responsible when you take them to the polls, take them with me, because there's a lot of research that shows that if you vote 3 times in a row, you'll become a lifelong voter. So what I really want to do is imprint that value on them. You must vote.
Excellent. Well, I
yeah,
think
my twins turn 18. They're 18 now, so this is the first election they can vote in. And it's all by mail, which of course I understand why and completely approve of. It's a little anticlimactic to cast your first ballot by mail, it must be said, but do it anyway. Go vote.
That's it. My 18-year-old just requested his absentee ballot. So that's exactly it. Well, let's jump into the book. We'll be talking now a lot about voting. I have my purple tie on, and for this celebration this week, I have not worn a tie since March. So it's a big deal. It's a big deal. All right. So how did you come up with the idea of the book? Where did you go from there? Tell folks about how this all got started.
Well, this really began in a conversation that I had with a friend of mine several years ago. And because I'd been involved in the 75th anniversary, I was talking about the 100. And my friend admitted, and she was embarrassed about it, that she didn't know anything about the suffrage movement. And the truth is, it's not really that surprising, because most of the time when we had gone through school, the suffrage movement maybe gets a paragraph or 2 in the US history book. I mean, my memory of high school US history is that it's basically war, battle. And I'm not really interested in battles at all. It's just not my thing. But I can easily name 3 generals from World War III, and I can name 3, plus generals from the Civil War. But most people can't name 3 suffragists. Pretty much the only one that anybody knows about is Susan B. Anthony. So I had read Becca's book on the 1913 suffrage parade and loved it. And I was talking to her at a book signing, and I pitched the idea of maybe doing a graphic novel or a comic. And we went ahead and we found a publisher, and we were getting ready to go. And what we realized is that trying to do any illustration was going to take way longer than we actually had time to do. And plus, Becca and I are not illustrators, but our publisher was still interested in doing something. So we started to think about what we could write about that would maybe be a little bit different. We knew there was a lot of great scholarly work. We knew there are a lot of sort of individually good biographies on figures. But what it always stood out to me, especially from my time at the archives, was how relevant the tactics of the suffrage movement were, especially considering that we think it's incredibly valuable to learn these things about how you can change the world without having to resort to violent revolution. We also wanted to make something that was fun and to make the suffragists relatable. So in some ways, the Suffragist Playbook is our attempt to talk about how women got the vote told to you by your girlfriend with the inside scoop on how to be an activist. And what we hope is that it's memorable and useful.
So what is the target age range?
Well, the truth is it's 13 and above. But if I was going to be honest with you, I would say that there are a lot of, again, people my age who don't know very much about it and probably aren't going to start off right away with a big, thick book. They want something that kind of gives them a chance to have a grounding in a lot of it. So it starts with 13 above, and we think it's really good for any of that audience. But my kids have read it multiple drafts, and they have understood it and liked it and had fun with it too. So hopefully it's a pretty wide group.
You know, it's also funny, Patrick, when we were first talking about this book and casting it as lessons you can take from the suffrage movement to become an activist yourself, we thought we might have to start with why you should become an activist and why you, as a young person, even before you could vote, can feel confident that you have a voice. And we don't have to say that anymore, right? I mean, between Malala, Greta, the Parkland kids, there are so many visible examples of successful young activists that we don't even need to start with that convincing. We just want to give you tools that will help you be successful in whatever cause you want to take up.
Great. Well, I know that, so my experience, similar to Lucinda, as the archives was preparing for the Rightfully Hers initiative, which is this massive 18-month celebration the archives is putting out with exhibits and traveling shows and programs and so forth. I learned a tremendous amount preparing and raising money for that effort, and having the opportunity to sit in on meetings where scholars, women's history scholars, were there. So I completely agree. It's really sort of left, unfortunately, out of the history books in the classroom in significant ways. So this is an opportunity to spotlight it, which is exciting. I think one of the things that strikes me as I learned about it is, one, the amount of time this went on. We're experiencing a certain a level of activity and activism right now around other subjects, which we'll get to in a little bit. But this was decades in the making. And so you mentioned marches, petitions, rallies, there was messaging, branding, and you touch on this in the book, which is fantastic. Are there 3 or 4 sort of key moments over that arc that gets us to 1919, 1920 that really stick in your minds?
I'd be curious to see if Lucinda has a different answer to this. But so if you date the beginning of the movement to the Seneca Falls Convention, and there's some argument for making it earlier, but let's start with Seneca Falls because that's how Susan B. Anthony couched as the origin myth when she was writing Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the history of the movement. So that was 1848. It was so much longer ago than people realize in terms of how long the movement took to be successful. So it was not that generation who lived to see the vote. And so certainly Seneca Falls, I think the split within the movement over the 15th Amendment gives Black men voting rights, not women. That caused a huge rift after the Civil War within the movement, where there were people like Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe and Frederick Douglass who said, we're abolitionists, we're going to take this as written, we'll fight for women next. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and their allies who said, we cannot accept this amendment as written. If we don't see women included in the 15th Amendment, it's going to be another generation. And so that was very formative in the movement in a destructive way. It slowed them way down. And then I would say the sort of end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century was really dull. You know, they didn't have much to show for their progress. Only a few states passed suffrage. They were losing adherence Harriet Stanton Blatch, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, said it was a movement that bored its adherents and appalled its opponents, which is like super not where you want to be as a social movement. So then I think the 1913 march and the subsequent tactics of the National Women's Party really sort of revitalized the movement, injected some new energy, some new blood in terms of recruits, some new fundraising. And then finally, I'd say it's kind of the last roll down the hill towards the amendment passing Congress in 1919 and being ratified in 1920 was New York passing suffrage in 1917. To me, that was like a huge turning point. It was the most populous state. Even fence sitters in Congress started realizing women were likely to vote, and they thought, well, they might as well vote for me, you know. So suddenly a lot of really reluctant suffragists changed their minds.
Yeah, I'm going to have to agree exactly with what Becca said. The one thing I might add, because I'd like to have a more positive take on 1869, which is when you had that split in the movement, is that is when the first territory, Wyoming, women get the right to vote. And I do think that does make a difference. At the time, it was sort of a cynical movement. It's basically a marketing thing. They were trying to get publicity for the state of Wyoming. There were only 1,000 women there, so it's not like it was going to make a big difference. But once you actually have a territory, and then Wyoming becomes a state and they enter as a state with women's suffrage, suffragists have an example of some place where women have suffrage and things have not all gone to hell in a handbasket. Right. They can say, look, you know, it was perfectly fine. The world did not, you know, men were not left at home, you know, juggling babies and laundry and completely hapless. And, you know, the social order did not completely fall apart. And I would definitely agree, I think, with New York, because that is the state that really makes the difference. You wind up getting a lot of Western states. But once you have New York, the biggest state on the map, they have the largest population, they have the most electoral votes. After that, it's just a matter of when.
And I don't even mind the people who change their mind for political reasons. I'm not going to judge them for not actually being feminist, for just being, self-centered elected officials, as long as they got there, and they're, because Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat and he was opposed to federal suffrage. And for his first administration, Democrats had both houses of Congress. The Democratic Party realized they were going to get blamed, and that this whole new raft of voters was, in danger of all becoming Republicans if they didn't do something. If that changes your mind and gets you to support the right thing, I'm all for it. It's okay. Self-interest on the way to the excellent goal is fine with me.
Very good. Well, besides the length of time, which I think people really struggle to realize to get to the actual amendment, the other thing your book does that I found was fantastic is it brought forward voices, names that folks are unfamiliar with. And there are so many characters, I'll use that in a polite way, over the course of time. So, and obviously there's an African-American component. You mentioned Frederick Douglass. So who are some of the ones that struck you as you were working on the book as, this person has to be in this book because this story isn't told?
Lucinda, this is your chance to talk about.
Okay, you know exactly what I'm going to say. Okay, it's a very long list because there are too many suffragists that people haven't heard of. But you're absolutely correct. I think I'm going to have to go with Frances Willard. You two are not surprised at all. Today, almost no one has heard of her, but in the late 1800s, she was arguably the second most widely known and admired woman in the world after Queen Victoria. She was so popular that when she dies unexpectedly in 1898 by the flu, over 30,000 people came by her coffin to pay their respects. She was the first woman to get a statue in Statuary Hall, something we talk a lot about these days, in the United States Congress, and she would not be joined there by another woman for 50 years, which is just a way of saying in her time, she was a really big deal. So who was she? For 20 years, she was a leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was the largest and the most influential women's group of the 19th century. What she did for suffrage, which was so important, was that she brought the movement into the mainstream. People had heard about it thanks to the work of Susan B. Anthony and others, but it was still a small, mostly niche kind of movement. Now, what we know from her letters, and this is Frances Willard is somebody I learned about when I worked at the archives, and I'd find all of these things from the WCTU and all of these letters and all these references to Willard and all these things that she had signed. So she was really somebody who was this interesting character to me. And we know from her letters that she was basically sort of a team suffrage from the beginning, but she was very, very careful about how she sold it to her members. Now, most of the suffragists at the time are making the argument that women should get the vote because it's fair and it's morally right. And what she does instead is say that she has a completely different argument. She says, mothers need to vote because they can vote for public policies that will have a big difference for their families. She called it the home protection ballot. And this was brilliant branding because she was able to get her huge following of mostly white, not entirely. It was an integrated, the WCTU was integrated, but mostly white evangelical Christians to approve of what was then still a pretty radical idea. Now, by the way, under Willard's leadership, the WCTU members got involved in a lot of social reform. She basically called it her do everything policy. And she said individual chapters could decide what they wanted to support, but she wanted them to get out there and support and agitate and do everything that they could to make a difference. So they did on things like temperance, suffrage, labor reform, 40-hour workday, education reform, and even social purity. Now, this may sound like something that, my kids are going to roll their eyes at today, but long before the Me Too movement, it was something where they tried to make not just women, but men accountable for what they were doing in their social lives, to put a fine point on it, in their sexual activities. And just in case you think that this isn't important, before they started to do this campaign, the age of consent for most girls in the United States and the various different states was somewhere between 10 and 12, except in Delaware, where the age of consent was 7. So basically, it legalized child prostitution. So there are a whole bunch of issues that they get involved with. And this is something that happens with the suffrage movement in general. The focus winds up being on getting the vote, but really there are a lot of other different satellite women's rights issues that are attached to it. Now, Willard is by no means perfect. And most of the time, if people have heard of her today, it's usually because of the controversy with Ida B. Wells, who accuses her correctly of using some language that demonizes Black men and immigrants in a lot of their pamphlets that they do on temperance and social purity and other things. And what Ida B. Wells is able to do is she eventually forces Willard and the WCTU to make a statement against lynching. So Willard's legacy is pretty complicated, but it's worth noting, at least, that Willard is called out by Wells, not because she is the worst actor. I hate to say it, but there's a long list of people and parties at the time who are the worst actor, but because the WCTU was such a hugely influential organization. And again, this is something that people forget about all of the time. It's not just important that you sell the moral right of why you have your argument. You have to sort of explain to people, why can you do something with the vote? What's the benefit going to be for the general public? Frances Willard to me is one of the most interesting characters.
Clearly. Rebecca, would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, so there are so many, of course, and it makes me mad every time I learn about a new one that I didn't learn about when I was formally studying history. And of course, so many of them are so impressive. I have a fondness for the ones that were also kind of hilarious. And, that reading their letters and their papers are a joy because they're so clever in addition to being so important. So someone like Alice Paul was really impressive, but she was, as far as I can tell, completely humorless. Whereas someone like Doris Stevens is a delight to read. Mary Church Terrell, who's starting to get more recognition, especially here in DC, because she was local. She was, I tried not to use a word that's a little bit of slang, but she was a superhero. She, and because she had a million master's degrees and spoke like 6 languages and was always beautifully dressed, because she sort of passed the social status markers for white women, she would often be the only African-American invited to their meetings and should, get in there under their, invitation because they thought she was acceptable and then should blow their minds, right? First of all, she'd give her speech in like 3 languages, but then she'd also remind them, oh, by the way, you're being really bad on the race issue. And so she continued, she stood in front of the White House and picketed in her 50s. In her 80s, she sat in at segregated lunch counters here in Washington. She just did not let up throughout her life and made enormous, obvious, tangible political gains.
I would say you mentioned earlier about how long the movement took. And that is one of the things that really, once you start studying some of these characters, really stands out. I mean, the suffragists tend to be they mostly live for a very long time into their late 80s. But the first generation still doesn't see suffrage passed. And somebody like Susan B. Anthony, what she does is sort of outlive everybody else. So she's still standing in 1906. And in fact, the last words that she gives in the last speech that she gives, the last word she has just a few days before she dies is failure is impossible, because she doesn't give up. And I've been thinking about it. I've decided if there was a theme song for Susan B. Anthony, it would be Willie Nelson's On the Road Again, because that woman was nonstop. She got out really there and she estimated that she gave anywhere from 75 to 100 speeches for 40 plus years. So it's a long, long time. But at the same time, they made a lot of big changes along the way. And that's sort of, for people who get frustrated with movements today taking such a long time, I don't think it's going to take 72 years to get some of the things we're looking at today changed. But it's not going to happen overnight. But at the same time, there'll be a lot of incremental changes that you may not recognize unless you can sort of pull yourself a little bit back from them to see. And they do make a big difference.
I think I should amend my comments on the record that these were all suffrage leaders. We said characters a couple times. As you were using that, I feel like we're diminishing all these roles that all add up, and how they're connected is pretty impressive. So you just touched on something, and we're going to get to questions in just a minute. So those of you who are watching, don't forget you can put your questions in the chat box. So feel free as we're talking to put those in now. So we've got a few in the queue. But I do want to touch on what's happening today. And I know you said you took out activism, as you didn't need to explain what activism was in the book per se, but the linkages of some of the strategies and actions they took to see meaningful change. We see this obviously in the civil rights movement, John Lewis, getting in good trouble. And fast forward to today. So help our viewers, tie those all together for us.
Not a day goes by when I don't see an activist using a tactic that the suffragists either invented or, exploited to maximum efficiency. So any march down Pennsylvania Avenue, they invented civil rights marches. We think of those as an artifact of the civil rights movement of the 60s, but absolutely not. The suffragists invented civil rights marches. Picketing in front of the White House, right? Everybody who stands in Lafayette Square with a sign is literally standing in the footsteps of suffragists. Before they did that in January of 1917, no one had ever done that before. Exploiting an event that doesn't go the way you expect it to go. So the 1913 parade was stopped by a huge unruly mob of spectators. And Alice Paul recognized from the very beginning that was the best thing that ever could have happened for the parade, that it was going to keep their cause in the news much longer than a perfect day would have. So when you see contemporary activists taking advantage of the news over clearing Lafayette Square for the president to stand in front of St. John's Church, had that been a sort of peaceful, everyone went home at curfew, that would have been a very different news cycle. And even things like the Black Lives Matter mural painted on 16th Street that our mayor here in Washington sanctioned, she could have chosen another street. She chose one that is right in front of the White House. So it's not just a statement, it's a statement specifically in the face of the federal executive in a way that the suffragists were constantly doing with Woodrow Wilson. And I just see it over and over and over again, using images incredibly well. We think of that as an Instagram artifact, but of course not. 100 years ago, the suffragists were doing it with their parades and pageants and costumes and visual imagery, viral messaging. I mean, I keep thinking what they would have done with Twitter. If you look at the text of some of their picket signs in 1917, they're so provocative. and they're a tweet, right? They're the equivalent of making a 1917 message go viral. So over and over again, I see just not even indirect, but very direct borrowed tactics from the suffragists and contemporary activism.
I think one of the links that's really fascinating to me is there's a lot of dialogue right now on how to be an ally. And I think that's something a lot of people are wondering, how do I do it right? What's the best way to be? So looking back at the suffrage movement, one of the things I found most interesting is the male allies and the role that they played, because what little you get on the suffrage movement hasn't always talked about the men, because you want to finally give women their due in their leadership roles. But the truth of the matter is, you can't pass a constitutional amendment. You can't give women the vote without men. In fact, by the time they finally pass the constitutional amendment in the House and the Senate, it is 100% men. I mean, 1918, the first time that they actually passed it in the House, Jeanette Rankin was a member of Congress, and she could vote for it. And it's a very dramatic story. They knew it was coming down to the wire. They needed every vote that they could. And you have some men who are carried in on stretchers. They have one representative from Tennessee, Sims, who has broken his shoulder, but he doesn't want to have it set because he's afraid that they'll knock him out and he won't be able to vote for suffrage. But then once he's voted, he stays there in great pain to sort of, you need to vote for suffrage, make everybody feel guilty, to make sure that all the votes come around. And the story that, always gets my heart is the representative from New York, who literally comes from the deathbed of his dying wife, who's a suffragist. And she had told him, I want you to go vote for suffrage. They need your vote. So he goes down, casts his vote, and turns right around to go up and plan her funeral. So it's this very emotional moment. It passes in 1918 in the House by just one vote. And when they hear it up in the galleries, the women out in the halls, they start singing this old hymn, Praise God from whom all blessings flow. But then the Senate doesn't pass it. So they have to start all over again. But Woodrow Wilson really wants to get this thing done. He doesn't care about it. But from a political viewpoint, as Becca said earlier, he wants to make sure it gets through. So he calls a special session. They bring everybody back in again, except Jeanette Rankin is no longer in Congress. It does pass, and then it goes off to the states. And it's sort of the same big drama all over again. You have to get males. You have to get, it's only men who are going to be voting for this. There are some African-American men, I believe in Illinois and New York, who are members of their state legislatures, who presumably would have had the opportunity to vote for him. But it's almost entirely white. It's white men, and it comes down to the wire in Tennessee. This is the very last state. They need to get it passed. It looks like the anti-suffragists are going to be successful in getting it tabled, and that's going to be the end of the run. And there's this young 24-year-old newly elected state legislator, and he's wearing a red rose, because it was called the War of the Roses. The anti-suffragists wore red roses and the suffragists wore yellow roses. So he's wearing a red rose. So they counted him as an anti-suffragist, but at the very last minute in the roll call, he votes for it. And the reason he gives is he says his mother wrote him a letter and she tells him to vote for suffrage. And he says, every good boy should follow the advice of his mother. And my kids are tired of me quoting that all the time.
Yeah, mine too. I'm going to embroider it on a pillow.
Yeah, there are so many men who do come through. And I think it's a fascinating thing, studying the allies from Frederick Douglass at the very beginning, lifelong ally for over 50 years, all the way into Harry Byrne, and seeing the role that they play. And it just makes it much more engaging, diverse story.
There's a movie in there somewhere, right? Well, let's jump into questions here. I want to welcome folks from, Alexandria, Charleston, South Carolina, Fort Worth, Frisco, Texas, Louisville, White Bear Lake, Minnesota, Dayton, Ohio, not sure, Hawaii. We've got a pretty good range here. This is exciting. So I want to go back. Someone had a question about the tactics between the two different organizations and when they split. And I want to be mindful of time, so I want to try and get through as much. So if you could somehow, in multiple decades of history, get us down to like those two organizations and what they did. Yeah.
So when they split, the sort of Stone, Blackwell, Howe, Douglas branch pursued a state-by-state strategy. And Anthony and Stanton continued to push for a federal amendment. And that mattered because the state-by-state strategy requires different politics, right? You need an organization on the ground everywhere. In some states, it was a referendum, and some it had to pass 2 successive legislatures. So it's really hard work. It's really hard to organize. It's hard to fundraise around. It's really slow going. But it's not a crazy strategy. The idea was that eventually there'd be enough men in Congress who represented women back home that a federal amendment would be inevitable. When they reunited, they stuck with that state-by-state strategy. And there's a subtext there because the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, were considered sort of federal overreach by the Southern states, that those amendments were imposing a philosophy on Southern states that didn't agree with them. This state-by-state strategy was, to some degree, a way to try to play nice with those still very bruised states. And in fact, sometimes they did use overtly racist tactics in that strategy. They'd go into Southern states and say, if you give women the vote, it guarantees white supremacy because white women will overwhelm the Black vote. By the way, it never worked. Anytime they used that argument, Southern states were systematically disenfranchising Black men with Jim Crow laws. That was working for them. They weren't interested in enfranchising a single new Black voter. But so the state-by-state strategy was slow, it was ineffective, it didn't recruit very well. And that's why that 1913 march matters so much, because not only was it a big news day and recruited a bunch of new folks to do something for the cause, it was an announcement that the federal amendment was back. So right at the head of the parade was this huge banner that said, we demand a constitutional amendment enfranchising the women of this country. Not like we politely ask, not we hope and pray, we demand. And so tactically, it was a very public announcement that they were going for suffrage at a federal level.
Great, thank you. What about the movement? Can you talk a little bit about how the movement maybe in Britain influenced what was happening in the US? And then there was a question, I think I know the answer to this from my prep over the last couple of years, but the term suffragist versus suffragette.
Okay, I can do that one really quickly too.
Put that one to bed.
So the British movement also did have its kind of slow, steady color within the line suffrage movement, but then they had this much more radical wing led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters. And the wing of the American movement that Alice Paul will go on to found, the National Women's Party, has been called militant. They had nothing on the British militants. The British militants were throwing bricks through windows. They were smacking policemen in the face to get arrested on purpose. At one point, they tried to set the prime minister's house on fire. They were not playing around. The American, even the radical American women never broke a single law. So, and then the term suffragist, suffragette, the word is suffragist. The British activists were made fun of in the press as suffragettes. It was meant to be patronizing, like, oh, you cute little suffragette. But they then took the word for themselves, co-opted it, infused it with their own power, as many activists have done since. So most properly, the word is suffragist. Suffragette refers to the British movement, specifically the militant wing of the British movement.
Very good. Are there tactics that you think they are the suffrage movement that is missing today? I know we have some technology that you mentioned earlier, but anything that they did that you feel like could be deployed these days?
Well, yeah. I think pretty much, Becca, do you want to take this?
No, go ahead.
I think what you do is you kind of go through some of their best tactics in time. I mean, you basically start off by telling your story. And that is a big thing that's happening right now. It used to be that you would go out and women would give speeches, and it was absolutely radical that women were speaking in public in the first place, because that wasn't something that women were supposed to do. Women weren't even supposed to applaud in public. They would wave their handkerchiefs, and that was called the Chautauqua salute. That was how, so you weren't supposed to make noise at all. And the fact that they're speaking in public, it's kind of a radical idea. It's also something that, you know, it's must-see speeching or something. So it draws big crowds when when Lucy Stone first starts getting out and talking about it, she'll have thousands of people who come to hear her speak. And I always wonder how she does this before they have a sound system that you can plug into or something like that. But that's really what you do in the beginning. And what you're doing when you do that sort of thing, and we're doing now, is that you're seeding the ground. So there are people who say, you know, there are sub-movements that have been around, modern movements, they didn't just happen this summer. You know, they started 10 years ago or 5 years ago. Why now? Well, what I would really say is that you're now starting to see some of those seeds take root and grow. It does take time. And that's one of the hardest things to understand, that patience is important. And also, to some extent, when the backlash comes, that means that you're getting very successful. There isn't going to be an organized backlash if people can just make fun of you and nobody takes you seriously. And that's something that just sort of shocked me when I would look at all the petitions that we had in the National Archives, the huge number of petitions we had from women against suffrage. And I thought, who are these women? What are they talking about? You know, and it's easy to portray them and think that some of them are just, out of touch, or, what do they know? But often they're not necessarily against the idea of women having political participation, but they wanted to stay outside of the political forum. So you're not going to have a monolithic movement. I guess that's something that I would say is important to consider as you go forward. There's not going to be one point of view that everybody shares. It's going to be pretty diverse. There are going to be different wings. Some of them are going to be radical. Some of them are going to be moderate. Some of the people who you think are going to be for a policy are going to be utterly opposed to it. And that's just how it is with big social change.
Can you talk a little bit about, sort of on the same tack, about Alice Paul's understanding of like PR and media tactics? You were starting to hint about that.
Yes, she was incredibly good at it. She, first of all, was the master of the visual image, so if you think about that image of the pageant at the 1913 parade of Columbia standing in her armor with her helmet on the front of the Treasury steps, that pageant on the Treasury steps had very little to do with suffrage. It was this kind of tortured allegory of Columbia summoning the virtues. But boy, did it look good in pictures. It's still the cover of my book 100 years later. So, and Alice Paul did all of that very, very intentionally. When you look at the pictures of the National Women's Party picketing at the White House, not only is it, women in a line with dark coats in front of a White House, and they've got their sashes at exactly the same angle, and it all looks great, but the signs themselves are this very easy to read sans serif font against a light background. They reproduce really, really well in black and white pictures. Again, completely intentional. One of my favorite examples of Alice Paul trying to manipulate the press to her own ends was, I'm going to keep coming back to the parade, but the second person in the parade was Inez Milholland, up on a white horse in a white dress with this starry crown on her forehead. And you might have seen that image a couple of years ago when the women in Congress wore white to the State of the Union. There were a lot of pieces about the role of white in the movement. But Inez Milholland was a labor lawyer. She was this incredibly accomplished professional. But the, breathlessly sexist press of the day always talked about how pretty she was. She was called the most beautiful suffragist in anything that mentioned her at all. So Alice Paul basically thought, you know what, if you're going to talk about her looks instead of her brains, I'm going to stick her in a white dress on a white horse and put a star on her forehead. And then maybe you'll take her picture and give some coverage to my cause. And you can make an argument about, the male gaze, and is that really pandering to, traditional notions of beauty, whatever. It worked, it got the press coverage that might not have happened if people were just digging into the nitty-gritty of voting rights.
So we're getting close on time. I do want to touch on a couple of other questions. So one was about the White House. Can you talk a little bit more about the Silent Sentinels?
Yeah, that's the name for the pickets. That's Harriet Stanton Blatch called them the Silent Sentinels. So that tactic started in January of 1917. 1916 was a really bad year for suffrage. Every state that had it on the ballot voted it down. Woodrow Wilson was reelected, not by a lot, but he was reelected. And Inez Milholland, she of the white dress on the white horse, actually collapsed on stage giving a speech and died in the hospital a few days later. And she was one of their best public speakers and a real bright light of the movement. And so as 1917 dawned, the National Women's Party thought, we can't do one more petition drive. We can't do one more march. We've just been doing this and doing this and doing this, and we have so little to show for it. So they came up with this idea of the Silent Sentinels. And they stood in front of the White House every day through January and February of 1917. And they thought they'd give it up at Wilson's second inauguration. At the time, the president was inaugurated on March 4th. But he continued to refuse to meet with them. So they thought, you know what, if he's not going to talk to us, we're going to keep showing up on his sidewalk. And even after April, when the US got involved in World War I, they kept it up. And, criticizing the president during wartime is going to lose you a lot of friends. There's a lot of people who think that's treason. But not only did they keep it up, their picket signs became more pointed and more critical, to the point where one of them says, Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten 20 million American women? Take the beam out of your own eye. Because he was on the international stage giving a speech a minute about the importance of democracy while he continued to be a roadblock to the enfranchisement of half of his own citizens. So that was a tactic that got a lot of attention. I don't know that it got a lot of support, right? Not all attention is good attention. I think at first it was just sort of amusing, and then it started to become quite controversial. And by the fall of 1917, the women were routinely getting arrested. And because they refused to stop and refused to be cowed, the sentences they were given escalated so crazily through the summer and fall of 1917 that eventually some of the women were sentenced to, 60 days in the workhouse for standing on the corner with a sign, which is not illegal in any way. They made up a charge. They called it obstructing the traffic on the sidewalk, which is not a thing. It's not a crime. And ultimately, in fact, all of those charges were vacated because it was admitted that it was completely trumped up. So it was, I think, as a tactic, really interesting by way of sort of pushing the political envelope and staying in the president's face and staying in the news when so much of the news cycle was dominated by World War I. I think it did lose some friends and some donors. And I think that actually had the sort of side effect of giving the more mainstream moderate wing of the party kind of cover. So Carrie Chapman Catt, the head of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, could say like, oh, my group would never do something crazy like picket in front of the White House. I'm a completely reasonable person, meet with me. And that's where what Lucinda was saying about the radical and the moderate in a social movement, they really do ultimately serve each other's ends if they don't destroy each other in the meantime. So I think picketing ultimately got a lot of attention. I'm not sure how many minds it actually changed ultimately.
Sure.
Well, to some extent, what it does is it moves the goalposts, and then you have your big moderate middle who can move a little bit farther down to the end.
Right. The whole continuum moves.
And that's part of the reason why I go on about Frances Willard. She helped move that big bulk of the fat part of the bell curve towards the goal of suffrage, and the National Women's Party is sort of keeping it on everybody's mind. So really, as a tag team, they were effective.
Well, this has been great. I know we're not going to get to every question. I do want to sort of wrap up. We talked a little bit about your experience voting, and just I know you hope that teenagers, pick this up and are inspired, take some lessons from this. So kids who can't vote today, they're watching what's happening in our democratic process right now. What advice do you have for them as sort of a closing note?
Well, I think kids today are better at social media than certainly I am. They do great stuff, and it's very effective. And you don't have to have the vote to make a difference. And that's, in the end, what we say is sort of our conclusion to our book, is that as important as voting is, it's all the other things that come around it that make it work. So just letting people know, this is an issue, telling the story, getting the word out there, bringing light to something, that makes a big difference. I would also say, for kids specifically, go with your parents to vote, be imprinted on that process of getting used to the idea that you're either going to go to the polls and vote, or your parent is going to pull out their ballot and you're going to watch them fill it out. Have that be something that's very sort of a regular part of what you're supposed to do in your life early on. And then I think so you can write letters to your representatives. And this actually matters if you write a handwritten note. They are so rare that when they do show up, they get a lot of attention. There are lots of different ways you can still do something. As we've seen by Becca referenced earlier, all the younger activists, without actually having to be able to vote yet. Just make sure that when you do vote, you do so regularly and you explain what you're voting for and why it matters. Because most of the time we don't put in our vote with a big, explanation that says, I'm voting for this candidate because I like their policy on X. So that's something you have to amplify that message really loudly so that that representative, most of the people in Congress, unlike most people, they want to keep their job. So they're pretty representative to what they think people want them to do. You just have to help light the way on what that thing is.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I would also say you can start small. You don't need to take on climate change as your first cause. You might want a stop sign at the end of your block, or you might want to have some say in what your English teacher assigns as reading. It doesn't matter what the cause is. You don't need to change the world tomorrow. But if you want a little practice in social organization and getting a cause heard and understanding your opposition and organizing, you pick something small and go for it. It all makes a difference.
That's great. That's a great way to wrap up. I really appreciate your time. Before we let you go, we do have, for our viewers, a special announcement from the National Archives Foundation. Last fall, I think many of you know, we honored our longtime board member, Cokie Roberts, with our Records of Achievement Award and an evening tribute. As part of the evening, we launched the Cokie Roberts Research Fund for Women's History. Well, with Rebecca here today, we're pleased to announce that the Cokie Roberts Research Fund for Women's History will be supporting a new fellowship that will be encouraging the next generation of journalists and authors to continue her legacy, to draw new audiences to the stories found in our country's past. We'll be rolling out the application, the details of the fellowship in October, but we couldn't let this important anniversary week go by without celebrating Cokie's legacy and the subject that was so close to her.
And this is such an incredibly perfect way to honor what she did and her involvement with the archives and her support of amplifying women's voices, both in history and contemporary writers of women's history. And I just can't wait to see what people do with that support and encouragement.
Excellent. Well, Rebecca and Lucinda, thank you for coming on today. I'm sure there'll be many more of these opportunities for you guys to talk about your book. I'll be mentioning the book is, I know, coming out later this fall. We've got a slide coming up. You can pre-order signed copies, which is exciting. The Suffragist Playbook. Go to the Archives store to do that. And if you're, while you're there pre-ordering your book, if you're interested in other merchandise about U.S. history or women's history, you may already know this, but we have the best gift shop in Washington, D.C. and online. So go on and check it out. Don't miss out on our 30 to 50% off through the end of the month, celebrating obviously the centennial. So we're excited about that. I want to also mention we've got a lot of programming coming up. You thought this was good today? How about at 5 o'clock? We'll see you in a little bit. We've got the 19, the musical. We've got the creators and the performers of 19 with clips from the show. That should be a terrific conversation. Tomorrow, we've got two programs from the National Archives, a family program at 1 o'clock. The education team will be talking to Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul, and Sojourner Truth. That will be a lively discussion, no doubt. And then tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock, Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers. Dr. Martha Jones will be talking about her forthcoming book as well. And then on Thursday, we've got two more programs. We've got your week planned out for you. At 1 o'clock, Ida B. Wells, journalist, abolitionist, will be talking about her life and the impact on African-American women. Following that presentation by a reenactor, Alelia Bundles will be joined in a conversation with Ida B. Wells' great-granddaughter, Michelle Duster. That'll be terrific to get her perspective on Ida B. Wells' contribution to the movement. And then Thursday evening at 5 o'clock Eastern Time, 100 years later, Women in Charge of the Ballot Box. We have three secretaries of state from New Jersey, Florida, and Washington who will be with us for a conversation on the important role they play in the election process and the continued struggle for women's rights. All of this programming is part of the National Archives Rightfully Hers initiative. As I mentioned, it's been going on for 18 months. It will continue to go on here. We want to thank all of our sponsors. You can see here on the screen. Because of their really this generous support, it wouldn't be possible without them. So we're very grateful for all of their partnership with the National Archives and the National Archives Foundation. On behalf of the National Archives Foundation, thank you for joining us today. Until our next program, be safe and be well.